A millionaire humiliated the cleaner for her appearance. But when she said 3 words during an important negotiation, she brought the millionaire to his knees. The towering glass facade of Caldwell Grand Hotel gleamed under the bright Manhattan sun, reflecting the city's unstoppable energy. Inside, the scent of polished mahogany, fresh-cut orchids, and expensive cologne filled the grand lobby, where men in tailored suits and women in designer heels glided effortlessly across the marble floor. Every detail, from the gold-trimmed chandeliers to the perfectly arranged floral centerpieces, spoke of wealth, power, and exclusivity. Patrick Caldwell moved through this world as if he owned not just the hotel, but the very air people breathed inside it. And in a way, he did. Every polished tile, every imported fixture, every contract signed within these walls carried his signature. He wasn't just a wealthy man, he was the wealthy man, a force of nature in the business world. His black suit, tailored to perfection, sat on his frame like a second skin. His piercing blue eyes scanned the space with the sharp precision of a man who had built an empire from the ground up. No detail escaped him. Not the slightly smudged window near the entrance. Not the out-of-place floral arrangement near the reception desk. And certainly not the woman mopping the floor near the elevators. She was just another piece of the background. One of the countless employees who made his world function smoothly, but whom he would never spare a second glance. He didn't need to. People like her existed to serve. They were invisible, insignificant. Mr. Caldwell, Elliot Grayson, his right-hand man, fell into step beside him, checking his tablet with the urgency of someone who knew that even the slightest mistake was unacceptable. The investors will be arriving tomorrow for the contract signing. Everything is prepared. Patrick nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. I don't want surprises. There would be none. Not in his world. Abigail Montgomery kept her head down, moving the mop in slow, practiced motions. Years of experience had taught her how to blend into the background, how to become part of the furniture in places like this. If she was quiet enough, if she never drew attention, she could get through another shift without trouble. The soapy water swirled across the pristine marble floor, erasing footprints left by people who would never look at her twice. The weight of the mop was familiar in her hands, the routine mechanical. It was easier this way. But deep down, something inside her stirred, a quiet ache she never allowed herself to acknowledge. There had been a time when she had walked through places like this, not as a worker, but as a guest. A time when she had spoken multiple languages with effortless grace, when her world had been one of influence, sophistication, and comfort. But those days were long gone. Now, she was just another employee in a uniform, cleaning up after people who would never remember her name. She was almost done when the sharp sound of approaching footsteps made her tighten her grip on the mop. She recognized that confident stride, the unwavering presence that commanded attention without a word. Patrick Caldwell. Averting her gaze, she stepped to the side, hoping to avoid any confrontation. She had spent years perfecting the art of going unnoticed, but fate had other plans. Patrick rounded the corner at full speed, his phone in one hand, his mind already on a meeting he hadn't even entered yet. He barely glanced up, until the impact sent a splash of cold, dirty water across his pristine suit. Silence fell over the lobby. Abigail felt her blood freeze as gasps of horror rippled through the nearby staff. Her heart pounded as she registered what had happened. Her mop, in a single careless motion, had ruined Patrick Caldwell's $5,000 suit. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement. Then, slowly, Patrick looked down at himself, taking in the mess of soap and water staining the dark fabric. His hands curled into fists, jaw tightening as the lobby seemed to hold its breath. The moment stretched painfully, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. "You..." His voice was dangerously low. Abigail wanted to disappear. "Are you completely useless?" His words cut through the tension like a blade, cold and sharp. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I'm sorry, sir," she finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry." Patrick let out a short, humorless laugh. "Do you even understand what you just did?" He peeled off his jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a nearby chair, his movements stiff with barely contained fury. Of course you didn't mean to." He cut her off, stepping closer. "People like you never mean to be a nuisance. But somehow, you always are. A flush of humiliation burned through her. The quiet murmur of onlookers only made it worse. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? She forced herself to look up. It was the first time she had met his gaze directly. And for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Something almost like hesitation. "It's just water," she whispered. The sheer audacity of her response made him scoff. "Just water." His voice was filled with mockery. "Do you think you get to decide what's just?" She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, waiting for her to crumble, to shrink away in shame. And for the first time in years, something inside her wanted to fight back. She wanted to tell him who she really was. That once, men like him had respected her father. That she had sat at tables where billion-dollar deals were discussed. That she had once belonged to the same world as him. But that world had been ripped away. So instead, she swallowed the words before they could escape. She lowered her gaze, gripped the mop tighter, and nodded. "I'll clean it up." Patrick exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Pathetic," he muttered before walking away, barely sparing her another glance. As he disappeared into the distance, conversations resumed, the tension dissolving as if nothing had happened. Staff members went back to their tasks, eager to pretend they hadn't just witnessed the scene. But Abigail stood there, her hands trembling around the mop, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She had let him humiliate her, but something told her this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. And next time, she wouldn't be just a nameless worker. The tension from the incident in the lobby lingered in Abigail's chest. Long after Patrick Caldwell disappeared from view, she forced herself to continue working. Gripping the mop as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded, the whispers faded. The routine of the hotel resumed, and yet, something inside her felt unsettled. By the time she finished her shift, exhaustion pulled at her limbs. The uniform clung uncomfortably to her skin, still damp from the unfortunate collision with Patrick. She made her way toward the employee exit, her movements stiff, her mind replaying the scene in an endless loop. She had seen humiliation before. She had lived through it, but there was something uniquely cruel about the way Patrick had looked at her, as if she wasn't even worth the breath he wasted scolding her. A man like that wouldn't remember her after today, but she wouldn't forget. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she exhaled, letting the chill soothe her burning cheeks. The city hummed around her, the streets alive with the energy of Manhattan. People hurried past, wrapped up in their own worlds. Completely unaware of the storm still raging inside her, she was nothing to them, and she was nothing to him. The realization cut deeper than it should have. She shouldn't care what Patrick Caldwell thought of her. And yet, as she boarded the subway home, her hands tightening around the strap of her worn-out bag, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something she couldn't yet name. The next morning, the world moved on as if nothing had happened. Patrick sat in the executive lounge of the Caldwell Grand, a steaming espresso placed carefully on the sleek marble table before him. His laptop screen reflected the numbers from the latest quarter, a satisfying display of success, dominance, power. Yet as he skimmed through the reports, his mind kept drifting, not to the billion-dollar deals, not to the upcoming negotiations, to her, that damn maid. He hadn't thought about an employee for more than a second in years, let alone someone as unimportant as a janitor. And yet, there was something about the way she had looked at him, not with fear, not with admiration, with something else, something that had irritated him far more than her clumsy mistake. Patrick. Elliot's voice pulled him back, and he straightened in his seat, pushing away the strange distraction. "The investors are arriving this afternoon," Elliot continued, setting a file in front of him. "I confirmed the details. The translation team will be on standby." Patrick nodded, flipping through the file with sharp focus. "Everything needs to be flawless." "It will be." Elliot hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking again. "About yesterday, what happened in the lobby?" Patrick's jaw tightened. "What about it?" "The staff has been talking." A flicker of annoyance sparked in his chest. He didn't care about gossip. He didn't care about the girl, or the incident, or the insignificant opinions of those beneath him. "It doesn't matter," he said flatly. "People talk, let them." Elliot nodded, but Patrick could sense his unease. "Just ensure there are no distractions today," Patrick added, closing the file. "We have too much at stake." As Elliot left, Patrick exhaled slowly, pushing back whatever lingering irritation still clung to him. It was over, forgotten, and soon, so would she be. Abigail moved through the hotel like a ghost, her presence unnoticed, her footsteps silent. She had long perfected the art of being invisible, but today, she felt watched, not directly, not openly, but the weight of the previous day's events still pressed down on her. She caught glimpses of her co-workers whispering when she walked past. She wasn't imagining it. The looks, the murmurs, the barely concealed curiosity. They all knew. They had all seen it. She had been publicly humiliated by the Patrick Caldwell, and in a place like this, that kind of moment didn't just disappear. Still, she carried on. What choice did she have? She had a job to do, a life to maintain. She had survived worse. She focused on her work, keeping her head down as she moved between the pristine hallways, her hands busy, her mind elsewhere. But just as she rounded a corner near the executive lounge, a sharp voice stopped her cold. "Excuse me?" She knew that voice. Her stomach clenched, but she forced herself to turn. Standing in front of her was a tall, impeccably dressed woman, her blonde hair twisted into an elegant bun, her sharp features set in mild distaste. A woman who didn't belong in the world of janitors and maids. "Are you the one who embarrassed Mr. Caldwell yesterday?" Abigail blinked, heat rising to her face as the words cut through her like glass. The woman sighed, as if speaking to a child who had misbehaved. "I see." She crossed her arms. "Listen, I don't know how things work in whatever place you came from, but around here, we don't tolerate incompetence." Abigail clenched her jaw, gripping her cleaning cloth so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Caldwell runs a business," the woman continued. "He has no patience for people who don't belong in his world. If I were you, I'd be careful. Mistakes like yours, they don't go unnoticed." With that, the woman turned and walked away, leaving Abigail standing frozen in place. The humiliation from yesterday had been one thing, but this was a warning, and for the first time in a long time, she refused to bow her head. Her father had once told her, when she was just a child, that the world only respected those who proved they belonged. And she did belong. They just didn't know it yet. But soon, they would. The morning of the investment meeting arrived with the usual efficiency that characterized Caldwell Grand Hotel. Every detail had been polished to perfection. The conference hall, set up for the exclusive negotiation, gleamed under the soft golden lighting. Crystal water glasses were placed at precise angles. The long mahogany table stretched like a runway for power, and the scent of fresh orchids, Patrick's personal preference, filled the air. The atmosphere buzzed with quiet anticipation. Today was important. No, today was critical. Patrick Caldwell sat at the head of the table, exuding the kind of unshakable confidence that had built his empire. Across from him, his executive team reviewed last-minute details, their movements brisk, their voices low and purposeful. He barely listened. His focus was elsewhere, on the billion-dollar contract about to be signed. It was a deal that would cement his global expansion, pushing the Caldwell brand into exclusive markets across Europe and Asia. The investors from Geon Holdings, a powerful multinational conglomerate, were set to arrive within minutes. They were elusive, calculating, and notoriously difficult to impress. Their interest alone was an achievement. Securing their contract would be a definitive victory. Nothing could go wrong. Patrick adjusted the cuff of his suit, ensuring that every inch of his appearance projected dominance. He had done this countless times before. Control the room, control the deal, control the future. And yet, somewhere deep in his mind, there was an irritation he couldn't shake. A lingering whisper of yesterday's embarrassment. The maid. Why the hell was he still thinking about her? It was absurd. She was nothing. A mistake. A momentary distraction in a world that didn't allow distractions. The double doors of the conference hall swung open, and Patrick immediately shut down the thought. It was time. Abigail moved through the hallways with practiced ease, her cleaning cart rolling smoothly along the marble floor. She had made peace with the fact that she was an invisible cog in the machine. That was how it had to be. But after yesterday's warning, something inside her had shifted. She had spent years hiding in plain sight, convincing herself that survival was the priority, that as long as she kept her head down, she would get by. But something about Patrick Caldwell's unapologetic cruelty had struck a nerve. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was waiting. For what? She didn't know yet. Her path took her past the conference hall, where security guards stood like statues. She barely glanced at them, until she heard the low murmur of voices inside. Then a sudden tense silence. A sharp voice cut through. "This is unacceptable." Abigail paused, recognizing the heavy accented English of one of the John Holdings executives. "Mr. Caldwell," another voice interjected, softer but firm. "We cannot proceed if communication is compromised. This deal is complex. Precision is necessary." There was an uncomfortable shuffle of papers. Patrick's voice came next, controlled but edged with irritation. "We have an excellent translation team prepared for this meeting." A third voice spoke, this one older, authoritative. "Your translators misunderstand key nuances of our language. There is a dialect issue. We do not negotiate without clarity." Silence. Abigail knew that silence. It was the sound of a deal slipping through someone's fingers. She glanced at the security guards, who remained impassive. They didn't care about whatever power struggle was unfolding inside. But she did, because she recognized that dialect. She hadn't heard it in years, but she remembered the sound, the intonation, the precision. For a brief, reckless moment, she considered walking away. It wasn't her business, but something made her hesitate. She wasn't sure if it was pride, defiance, or fate itself. But before she could stop herself, she turned, pushed past the doors, and spoke. The air in the conference hall shifted the moment Abigail's voice filled the room. Fluent, confident, precise. Patrick stiffened, his sharp gaze snapping to the last person he ever expected to see here, Abigail Montgomery. And she wasn't cleaning the floors. She stood tall, her uniform now the only thing marking her as a staff member. But there was no trace of the timid maid he had berated. The room seemed to freeze as the John Holdings representatives turned toward her, their expressions unreadable. Then, one of them, a man in his 60s with graying hair, narrowed his eyes. He responded in the same dialect, testing her. Without hesitation, Abigail answered. A beat of silence passed. Then, to Patrick's absolute disbelief, the old man smiled. "Very good," he said in accented English. "Finally, someone who speaks properly." A murmur of approval rippled through the delegation. One of them nodded toward Patrick. "If this woman remains as an interpreter, we can continue." Patrick's fingers curled against the table. What the hell was happening? His translators, highly paid professionals, had failed, and a janitor had just saved the meeting. Abigail turned to him then, her expression neutral, waiting. Patrick felt his pride crack. Just a fraction. He had no choice, with the weight of the room pressing down on him. He gave a tight nod. "She stays." Abigail turned back to the investors, a quiet, unreadable look in her eyes. And then, with an ease that left Patrick reeling, she continued the meeting as if she had belonged there all along. The conference hall doors finally shut behind them after hours of negotiations, and the deal was secured. Patrick remained at the head of the table, his hands clasped together, his mind still catching up to the impossible reality of what had just happened. Elliot stood beside him, equally dumbfounded. Where the hell did she learn that? Patrick didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he had underestimated someone, and it infuriated him, the maid, the woman he had dismissed without a second thought, the woman who had just saved his empire. Patrick had always thought of people in categories, important or unimportant, useful or disposable, and yet, Abigail Montgomery had just rewritten the rules of his world, and he didn't like it. The weight of what had just happened didn't settle immediately. As Abigail left the conference room, she felt the lingering heat of countless eyes on her back. She had never stood in a room like that as anything other than invisible. Yet, in a matter of minutes, she had altered the course of a billion-dollar deal and left the most powerful man in that room speechless. She should have felt triumphant, but instead, she felt something far more dangerous. Exposed. Her heart pounded as she pushed the conference doors open and stepped back into the hallway, desperate for air. The pristine corridors of the Caldwell Grand suddenly felt suffocating. She could still hear the murmurs of executives inside, the weight of their curiosity pressing down on her. She hadn't planned for this. She had spent years carefully hiding, blending in, keeping her past locked away where no one could reach it. One reckless moment, one decision to step forward, and she had shattered the illusion she had built for herself. And worse, he had noticed Patrick Caldwell. The man who had barely spared her a glance before had looked at her today like she had defied the laws of his universe, like she had no right to exist in his world as anything but a maid. She exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening into fists. It didn't matter. She had done what needed to be done. The deal was secured, and Patrick would go back to his world, leaving her to fade into the background once again. At least, that's what she told herself. Patrick watched the doors swing shut, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, he had been caught off guard. It wasn't just that Abigail Montgomery had saved the meeting. It was how effortlessly she had done it. No hesitation, no uncertainty. She had commanded the conversation in ways that his highly paid translators couldn't, and he had no idea how or why. Elliot cleared his throat beside him, breaking the silence. That was unexpected. Patrick's jaw tightened. To say the least. The investors were impressed, Elliot added carefully, still gauging Patrick's mood. I think this may have actually strengthened the deal. Patrick already knew that. The John Holdings executives had practically lit up the moment Abigail had spoken their dialect. If anything, her presence had earned him points he hadn't even considered before. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was that he didn't like surprises. He didn't like not knowing. Find out everything about her, Patrick said suddenly, his voice low and sharp. Elliot blinked. Sir, I want to know where she learned that language. Her background, her history, everything. There was something off about Abigail Montgomery. She wasn't just some ordinary hotel worker who happened to speak a rare dialect fluently. There was more to this story, and Patrick hated being the last to know anything. Elliot hesitated, then nodded. I'll look into it. Patrick barely acknowledged him. His mind was already turning over possibilities, calculating outcomes. Because if Abigail Montgomery had secrets, he was going to find them. Abigail made it as far as the staff break room before her legs finally gave out. She sank onto a chair, pressing her hands against the cool surface of the metal table, trying to steady her breathing. You okay? She glanced up to find Sarah, her closest, perhaps only friend at the hotel, watching her with narrowed eyes. Abigail hesitated, then gave a weak nod. I'm fine. Sarah scoffed. Yeah, sure. That's why you look like you just saw a ghost. She sat across from Abigail, arms crossed. Everyone's talking about what happened. You walked into a billion-dollar meeting and saved Caldwell's ass. Abigail winced. I didn't do it for him. I know that, Sarah said. But he doesn't. Abigail exhaled. That was what worried her. Patrick Caldwell wasn't the kind of man who let things go. He was ruthless, calculating. He would want to know who she was, and that meant her days of hiding were numbered. Sarah studied her for a long moment. I know you, Abby. You don't do things like this. You keep your head down. You make yourself invisible. What the hell changed? Abigail wasn't sure. Maybe it had been the look in Patrick's eyes yesterday when he had humiliated her. Maybe it was the way he had dismissed her like she was nothing. Or maybe deep down, it had been the realization that she was tired of being overlooked. I don't know, she admitted. Sarah leaned back, still watching her. Well, whatever this is, you just made yourself very visible. Abigail swallowed hard. She knew that, and she wasn't sure if that terrified her or thrilled her. Patrick wasn't patient. By the time he reached his office, he was already scrolling through his phone, waiting for Elliot's update. It came faster than expected. Elliot, you're going to want to see this. Patrick clicked on the attachment. A file loaded onto his screen, and as he skimmed the contents, something shifted inside him. Abigail Montgomery wasn't who he thought she was. She had no standard background check, no clear records of early employment. There were gaps, years missing, and then, buried within the details, something stood out. Her last known guardian had been a high-profile diplomat. Patrick's grip on his phone tightened. That wasn't the kind of connection someone like her was supposed to have, but the real kicker came when he scrolled down further and saw the last name. Montgomery. It nagged at him. like something half-remembered from a distant conversation. He didn't have time to place it now, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary maid. Patrick Caldwell never ignored an advantage, never let something useful slip away, and Abigail Montgomery had just become very interesting. Abigail knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into the hallway later that afternoon. There was a shift in the air, and when she turned the corner, she saw him. Patrick stood near the staff corridor, arms crossed, waiting for her. She stopped in her tracks, pulse quickening. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unreadable. "Miss Montgomery," he said smoothly, his voice laced with something almost dangerous. "We need to talk." Abigail's fingers tightened around the strap of her cleaning cart, her pulse quickening at the sight of Patrick standing in front of her. He was waiting, his posture relaxed but his eyes razor-sharp. Scanning her with the same scrutiny he reserved for business rivals, she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time she had been cornered by powerful men who thought they could intimidate her. She had spent years learning how to navigate spaces where she wasn't meant to belong. Still, she hadn't expected this confrontation to happen so soon. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, keeping her voice neutral. "Is there something you need?" Patrick didn't answer right away. He was studying her, measuring every shift in her expression. She had seen this look before, the look of a man who had already decided he was above her. "You're full of surprises, Miss Montgomery." The way he said her name sent a flicker of irritation down her spine. It wasn't casual, it was calculated. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Patrick's lips curved into something almost amused, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't insult my intelligence." He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "You walked into a billion-dollar meeting and spoke fluently in a dialect that most of my high-level translators couldn't even begin to understand. A janitor doesn't just happen to know that language." She refused to react. Patrick tilted his head slightly, reading her silence. "You weren't always a maid, were you?" A muscle in her jaw twitched, his smirk deepened. Just a fraction, as if he had confirmed something without her saying a word. Abigail wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I think I've already taken up too much of your time." "Mr. Caldwell," she said smoothly, shifting her cart forward in an attempt to end the conversation. But Patrick moved, blocking her path. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt charged, filled with something unspoken. Patrick wasn't letting this go, and Abigail refused to give him an inch. "You're wasting your time," she said finally, keeping her tone polite but firm. "Whatever you think you know about me, it doesn't matter. I clean floors, Mr. Caldwell, that's all." Patrick exhaled slowly, as if debating whether or not to press further. Then, to her surprise, he stepped aside, but the way he looked at her, like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve, made her stomach tighten. "This isn't over, Miss Montgomery," he said, voice smooth as silk, and then, just like that, he walked away. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had known this moment would come. She had known that stepping into that meeting would draw attention to her, but she wasn't prepared for him. Patrick Caldwell was relentless. He was used to owning people, to getting exactly what he wanted. And now, for whatever reason, he wanted to know who she really was. That was dangerous, because the truth wasn't just a secret. It was a liability. Patrick returned to his office, but his mind wasn't on contracts or numbers. It was on her, Abigail Montgomery. She had held her ground against him. That wasn't common. He was used to people backing down, to them knowing their place. She hadn't, and that only made him more determined to get answers. "Sir," Elliot stepped into the office, holding a fresh stack of reports. "I found some additional information." Patrick leaned back in his chair, motioning for him to continue. "There's almost nothing about Abigail Montgomery before she turned 18, Elliot said, placing the folder on his desk. "But I dug deeper. Her last known guardian was a diplomat named Charles Beaumont." Patrick's fingers stilled. He knew that name. Charles Beaumont had been one of the most influential foreign negotiators of his time, a man who had moved in circles of power that even Patrick had barely scratched the surface of. What the hell was she doing in his care? Patrick muttered, flipping through the documents. Elliot hesitated. "There's more." Patrick glanced up. Her father was Richard Montgomery. Patrick froze. Now he understood why the last name had seemed familiar. Richard Montgomery had been a financial powerhouse, one of the most respected investors in the industry. And then, years ago, he had lost everything, destroyed by a scandal that, if Patrick remembered correctly, had involved betrayal from his closest business partner. Patrick's mind worked rapidly, piecing the puzzle together. Abigail Montgomery wasn't just a maid. She was the daughter of a man who had once stood at the top of the financial world, before someone had taken it all from him. And now, for reasons Patrick didn't yet understand, she had ended up in his hotel. A maid, a woman who spoke fluent languages that only high-ranking diplomats knew, a woman who had saved his deal without breaking a sweat. Patrick closed the folder, his pulse steadying. She was hiding something, and he was going to find out exactly what it was. Abigail sat on the edge of her small bed, staring down at the delicate silver chain wrapped around her fingers, her mother's necklace. She had worn it every day since she was a child, a quiet reminder of the life she had lost. Now, it had nearly given her away. The moment George Beaumont, the Gian Holdings executive, had noticed it. She had seen the recognition in his eyes, the way he had looked at her as if she were someone important, someone who didn't belong in a maid's uniform. She closed her fingers around the pendant, her chest tightening. She had spent years surviving, keeping her head down, erasing the pieces of herself that once belonged to another world. And in a single reckless moment, she had exposed herself. And worse, she had done it in front of the one man who would never let it go. Patrick Caldwell was going to keep digging, and if he found the truth, if he figured out who she really was, everything she had built for herself would come crashing down. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't let that happen. But deep down, she knew the truth. It was already too late. Abigail barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Patrick's piercing gaze, the way his expression had shifted the moment he realized she wasn't just another maid. He'd already suspected something. She could feel it. And now, after that encounter, there was no doubt in her mind. Patrick Caldwell was going to dig deeper. And if he found out who she really was, she had no idea how much damage it would cause. By the time the sun rose over Manhattan, Abigail was already up. Staring out the window of her tiny apartment, the city was awake, moving forward as if nothing had changed. But for her, everything had. She couldn't afford to let Patrick unravel her past. She had spent years burying it, making sure no one connected her to the girl she used to be. And yet, one reckless moment had put everything at risk. She needed to take control before it was too late. Patrick tapped his fingers against his desk, staring at the files in front of him. Richard Montgomery. It had been years since he had last heard that name, and now it had reappeared in the most unexpected place, in the form of a woman who should have been nothing more than another faceless worker in his hotel. He had spent most of the night going through every record he could find. Richard Montgomery had once been one of the most powerful investors in the industry, brilliant, respected, untouchable, until everything had collapsed. The scandal that had destroyed him had been brutal. Embezzlement, fraud, whispers of a betrayal from someone close. And when the dust settled, Montgomery had disappeared, his fortune gone, his reputation shattered. And now, his daughter was scrubbing floors in the Caldwell Grand. Patrick didn't believe in coincidences. Abigail Montgomery wasn't just hiding. She was running from something, and he was going to find out exactly what. A sharp knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Elliot stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "I have more information." Patrick motioned for him to continue. Elliot placed another file on his desk. "This was hard to find, but it confirms what we suspected." Abigail Montgomery was raised among diplomats, international elites. She was fluent in 5 languages by the time she was 15. Her father had set up trusts in her name, investments that should have made her one of the wealthiest women in the country. Patrick flipped open the file, scanning the pages. Trusts that had been emptied, accounts closed. "She lost everything," Elliot said quietly. "After her father's downfall, she disappeared from society. No connections, no financial support. It's like she erased herself." Patrick exhaled slowly, tapping the edge of the folder against the desk. Why? If Abigail Montgomery had once belonged to the world of wealth and power, why would she throw it all away to work as a maid, unless she had no choice? His mind worked quickly. calculating. If someone as intelligent and well-educated as Abigail had chosen to hide, it meant one thing. She was afraid, and fear was something Patrick could use. He stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket. "Where are you going?" Elliot asked. Patrick smirked. "To have a conversation with Miss Montgomery." Abigail was in the middle of restocking supplies when she felt the shift in the air. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. Patrick Caldwell radiated presence. She exhaled slowly before straightening and turning to face him. He was leaning casually against the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Is there something you need?" He studied her for a moment, then stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind him. "I've been thinking about you, Miss Montgomery." Her stomach twisted at the way he said her name, like he had already unraveled part of the mystery and was waiting to see how she would react. "That's concerning," she replied smoothly, masking her nerves. Patrick let out a short laugh. "I imagine it is." He took a slow step closer, tilting his head slightly. "Tell me, how does a woman who was raised among the world's elite end up working as a janitor in my hotel?" Her fingers tightened into fists at her sides. So he knew. She had expected this, but the reality of it still sent a jolt of panic through her. She lifted her chin. "I don't know what you're talking about." Patrick's gaze sharpened. "I think you do." Silence stretched between them. He wasn't going to let this go. Abigail forced herself to remain still, meeting his gaze evenly. "Why does it matter?" Patrick smirked, but there was no amusement behind it. "Because people don't just disappear, Miss Montgomery, and they certainly don't go from living in mansions to mopping floors unless they're hiding from something." She said nothing. Patrick took another step forward, lowering his voice. "What are you running from?" Her pulse roared in her ears. She couldn't tell him. She wouldn't. So she did the only thing she could. She deflected. "I could ask you the same thing," she said. Patrick's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, and that's when she knew. He had his own secrets. Too. A slow, amused smile curved his lips. "Clever." She didn't respond. He exhaled, glancing around the small storage room before looking back at her. "You saved my deal yesterday," he admitted. "I don't like owing people." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Is this your version of gratitude?" His smirk deepened. "No, this is my version of curiosity." There it was again. That relentless side of him, the one that had built his empire. He wasn't going to stop until he got the answers he wanted, and that terrified her. She needed to shut this down now. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "but I have nothing to hide." His blue eyes locked onto hers, and she knew he didn't believe her. But after a long, weighted pause, he stepped back. "For now," he murmured. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Abigail let out a shaky breath, pressing her hands against the shelves behind her to steady herself. She had bought herself time, but Patrick Caldwell wasn't done with her, not even close. Patrick Caldwell didn't like uncertainty. He thrived on control, on predictability, on knowing every piece of the game before his opponents even had a chance to move. But Abigail Montgomery was an enigma, and Patrick hated unsolved puzzles. He sat in his office, fingers tapping lightly against the mahogany desk, his mind replaying every interaction he'd had with her, the composed demeanor, the sharp wit, the way she had refused to cower before him. That wasn't the behavior of someone accustomed to being invisible. She had secrets, and he was going to rip them open. His gaze shifted to the files on his desk, records of Abigail's past, financial documents detailing the rise and fall of Richard Montgomery. It was all there, in black and white. The man had been a powerhouse, a visionary, and then he had been ruined. Patrick had seen it happen before, men at the top being devoured by their own ambitions. But there was something about this case that didn't sit right. The numbers, the timing, the betrayal. There was more to the story, and Patrick was going to find out what. Abigail moved through the hotel like a ghost, keeping her head down, her hands steady as she wiped down the grand marble staircase. But her mind was anything but calm. Patrick Caldwell knew too much. She had seen it in his eyes. That hunger for answers, the same hunger that had destroyed her father. She had spent years ensuring no one could ever connect her to Richard Montgomery, and in one reckless moment she had undone it all. Her grip tightened around the cloth in her hands. She couldn't let him dig deeper. She had barely survived the last time, and she wasn't sure she could survive it again. A voice broke through her thoughts. Abigail. She turned to find Sarah watching her. Concern etched across her face. You look like you're ready to murder someone, Sarah said, folding her arms. What's going on? Abigail forced a small smile. I'm fine, Sarah snorted. Yeah, and I'm the Queen of England, Abigail exhaled, glancing around before lowering her voice. Patrick Caldwell is asking questions. Sarah's eyes widened. What kind of questions? The kind that could ruin everything. Sarah's expression darkened. She had been the only person Abigail had trusted with pieces of her past, the only one who knew just how much Abigail had lost. You need to be careful, Sarah whispered. Guys like him, they don't stop until they get what they want. Abigail knew that, and that's what terrified her. Patrick wasn't the only one dealing with problems. The cracks in his empire had started as whispers, small rumors among investors, murmurs of irregularities in his financial reports, nothing that couldn't be dismissed. Until now. Now, those whispers were turning into headlines. Patrick sat at the head of the long glass conference table, his executive team shifting uncomfortably as Elliot laid down the latest reports. The auditors are looking into discrepancies in the Singapore expansion, Elliot said, his voice measured but firm. Some investors are pulling out until the situation is clarified. Patrick's jaw tightened. This is nothing but corporate paranoia. Elliot hesitated. It's more than that, sir. Some of the numbers don't add up. A heavy silence filled the room. Patrick's fingers curled against the armrest of his chair. This wasn't possible. He had built this company from the ground up. He had outmaneuvered competitors, crushed rivals, ensured that Caldwell Enterprises stood untouchable. And now, someone was coming for him. His mind worked quickly, turning over possibilities. Who had access to these numbers? Who stood to gain from this? And then, something clicked. There had been one other time he had seen something like this. One other time a company had been torn apart from the inside. Richard Montgomery. Patrick's eyes narrowed. Had Abigail known about this? Was that why she was here? Abigail knew something was wrong the moment she stepped onto the employee floor. The air felt off. And then, she saw them. 2 men in suits, waiting. She stiffened, recognizing the posture, the cold professionalism in their expressions. Auditors. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. The last time she had seen men like them. Her father had been fighting for his life. She forced herself to keep moving, gripping the handle of her cleaning cart tighter, willing herself to breathe. She wasn't that girl anymore. She was just a maid, a nobody. And yet, as she walked past, one of the men turned, his gaze landing directly on her. Abigail's breath hitched, because there, on his tablet screen, was a name, Richard Montgomery. Panic surged through her. They were investigating her father, which meant they were going to find her. Patrick sat in his office, his fingers steepled together as he watched the chaos unfold. His empire was under attack. Investors were pulling back, questioning his credibility. The auditors were circling, looking for weaknesses, searching for blood in the water. And yet, his thoughts kept drifting back to her, Abigail Montgomery. Her father had lost everything when someone inside his own circle had betrayed him. And now, Patrick was starting to wonder, was the same thing happening to him? A sharp knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Elliot stepped inside, his face tense. You're going to want to see this. He placed a document on Patrick's desk. Patrick scanned the first few lines, and his entire body went still. This wasn't just an investigation. This was a setup. Someone had been manipulating his financial records, and now he was being framed for a crime he hadn't committed. For the first time in his career, Patrick Caldwell felt something unfamiliar crawl into his chest. Panic. Because whoever was doing this wasn't just trying to take his money. They were trying to destroy him, and the only person who might have any answers was the woman he had humiliated, the woman whose father had suffered the exact same fate. Patrick grabbed his coat, his movements sharp, determined. There was only one person he needed to see right now, and this time, he wasn't asking questions, he was getting answers. Abigail had spent years preparing for this moment, though she hadn't known it at the time. Every day she had spent scrubbing floors, every quiet moment she had spent observing people who thought she was invisible. It had all been leading to this. The past was coming for her, and this time, she wasn't going to run. She had barely stepped into the staff corridor when she heard his voice. "Miss Montgomery." Her footsteps faltered, her grip tightening around the cleaning cart. She had expected this, but not so soon. She turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral. Patrick Caldwell stood just feet away, his posture controlled, but his eyes told another story. They were sharp, calculating, filled with an urgency she hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," he said. Abigail lifted a brow, feigning innocence. "Should I be concerned the last time you wanted to talk?" It wasn't exactly a friendly conversation. Patrick's jaw twitched. "This is different," she could tell. The arrogance that usually laced his words was still there, but it was cracked, slightly off balance. Whatever had happened since their last conversation, it had shaken him. "Good?" She exhaled and set her cleaning supplies aside. "All right, let's talk." Patrick led her into one of the executive boardrooms. Empty, quiet, too polished. A room designed for high-stakes negotiations, for men in suits who controlled the world with the stroke of a pen. Abigail didn't belong here. At least that's what he had thought before. Now he wasn't so sure. He turned to face her, crossing his arms. "You knew, didn't you?" Abigail tilted her head. "Knew what?" His patience snapped. "That this was coming, that someone was trying to destroy me the same way they destroyed your father." A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. She met his gaze, unflinching. "You think this is about you?" Patrick's brows furrowed. "Your empire is crumbling, Mr. Caldwell," she continued, stepping closer. "Your investors are pulling out. Your name is being dragged through the mud, and you think I planned this." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "You're so used to being untouchable that you can't even see when you've been played." Patrick's jaw tightened. He hated that she was right. "Then tell me who did this," he demanded. Abigail crossed her arms. "Why would I help you?" Silence. Patrick wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to people bending, breaking under his authority. But Abigail Montgomery wasn't like anyone else he had ever dealt with, and she wasn't bending. He let out a slow breath, controlling his frustration. "Because whoever is doing this to me also destroyed your father." That hit its mark. He saw it in the flicker of emotion that passed over her face. A flash of old wounds, buried but never forgotten. Abigail had spent years hiding from her past. But now, it was forcing its way back into her life, demanding her attention. She had a choice: walk away and let Patrick Caldwell fall, or use him to uncover the real enemy. She exhaled slowly. "I don't have all the answers," she admitted, "but I know where to start." Patrick's eyes locked onto hers. "Then let's start." They sat across from each other, the tension thick between them. Abigail pulled out her phone, scrolling through an old document she had saved for years. A list of names. "My father didn't just lose everything overnight," she began. "Someone orchestrated it, a series of fake investments. Financial reports that were manipulated just enough to make it look like he was committing fraud." She turned the screen toward him. "Sound familiar?" Patrick stared at the data, his expression darkening. It was exactly what was happening to him now. His stomach tightened. He had thought he was in control, that he knew the game better than anyone, but someone had outplayed him, and that wasn't something he could accept. Abigail continued, her voice steady. "There's one name that stands out. Jonathan Pierce." Patrick's fingers curled into fists. He knew that name. Jonathan Pierce had been involved in some of the biggest financial deals in the past 2 decades. A man with no loyalty, no conscience, only ambition. "He was my father's business partner," Abigail said quietly, "and he betrayed him." Patrick exhaled, piecing it together. "And now he's coming after me." Abigail nodded. History repeats itself. Patrick hated the idea of being anyone's pawn, but that's exactly what this was. Someone had set him up. Someone had made sure that his empire would collapse the same way Richard Montgomery's had, and Abigail had been right all along. He let out a slow, measured breath. "Then we stop him." Abigail studied him for a long moment. Patrick Caldwell had spent his entire life looking down on people like her, people he thought were beneath him, unworthy of his time. And now, he was asking for her help. It should have been satisfying, but it wasn't about that anymore. Because if Jonathan Pierce had orchestrated this, he wasn't just coming for Patrick. He was coming to bury the last remnants of the Montgomery name. And Abigail wasn't going to let that happen. Patrick stood near the window, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, his mind racing. If Abigail was right, if Pierce was behind this, then Patrick wasn't just fighting to save his company. He was fighting to take back control. He turned back to her. "I want every detail. Everything you know about Pierce." Abigail smirked slightly, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, now you trust me." Patrick hated the position he was in, but he wasn't an idiot. She was the only person who understood what was happening, and that made her his greatest asset. "Let's just say," he said slowly, "that I trust your hatred for Pierce more than I trust my own instincts right now." Abigail chuckled softly, shaking her head. "That's probably the smartest thing you've ever said." Patrick smirked, but there was no amusement behind it. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning, and for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. Patrick Caldwell had always believed that power belonged to those who took it. From the moment he had built his empire, he had lived by a simple rule: control or be controlled. Every deal, every strategic partnership, every enemy he had crushed beneath his feet had only reinforced this belief. Yet now, sitting across from Abigail Montgomery, he felt something he hadn't in years: vulnerability, and he hated it. She watched him carefully, the slightest hint of amusement flickering in her sharp hazel eyes. Patrick knew that she enjoyed this, watching him struggle to admit that he needed her help, that he wasn't as untouchable as he pretended to be. It made his blood boil. But emotions didn't win wars, and make no mistake, this was war. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Jonathan Pierce set me up." Abigail nodded. "Yes." Patrick exhaled through his nose. "Then why come after me now? What does he gain?" Abigail hesitated. "I have a theory." Patrick arched a brow. "By all means, enlighten me." She ignored the sarcasm. "Pierce doesn't just destroy people randomly. He does it when they become a threat." Patrick frowned. "I don't work with him. I don't even compete with him directly." "Not yet." Patrick stilled. Abigail's gaze was unwavering. "Your company is expanding. You're entering the same markets that Pierce has controlled for years. Maybe you didn't mean to step into his territory, but you did, and he's making sure you don't survive long enough to challenge him." Patrick cursed under his breath. It made sense. Pierce wasn't just trying to ruin him. He was eliminating competition before it even became a problem. It was ruthless, strategic, and exactly what Patrick himself would have done. His jaw clenched. "Then we stop him before he finishes the job." Abigail let out a short, humorless laugh. "You make it sound simple." Patrick gave her a tight smile. "It is. I don't lose." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Your empire is already crumbling, Caldwell. You've already lost." His entire body went rigid. Abigail knew exactly where to strike. She saw through the arrogance, through the control he pretended to have. And she was right, for the first time. Patrick Caldwell was on the losing side, and he didn't know how to handle it. The news broke within hours. Caldwell Enterprises under investigation for financial fraud. Patrick stood in his office, his grip tight around the glass of whiskey in his hand as the headlines flashed across the television screen. His company, his name, was being dragged through the mud. Elliot entered the room, his face grim. "It's worse than we thought." Patrick turned slowly. "How bad?" Elliot exhaled. "We lost 2 more investors this morning. Stock is dropping fast. The board is panicking." Patrick ground his teeth. He had spent years crafting his image, building a reputation that was untouchable. And now, he was bleeding out in public. And Jonathan Pierce was the one holding the knife. Elliot hesitated. "Sir, if we don't do something fast, they might move to push you out." Patrick's fingers tightened around his glass. "Over my dead body." Elliot swallowed. "Then we need to act now." Patrick knew that. But there was only one person who could help him now, and he hated that fact more than anything. Abigail wasn't surprised when he showed up at her apartment. She had been expecting it. She took her time answering the door, letting him stew when she finally opened it. She found Patrick standing there, tension radiating from every inch of his body. His suit was still immaculate, his posture controlled, but his eyes told a different story. He was losing, and Patrick Caldwell did not handle losing well. "I assume you're not here to borrow sugar," she said dryly. Patrick exhaled sharply. "I need your help." Abigail leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Funny. I remember you saying I was insignificant just a few days ago." He closed his eyes for a brief second, visibly reining in his frustration. "I was wrong." Abigail lifted a brow. "Come again." Patrick gritted his teeth. "I was wrong." She let the moment stretch, savoring the rare sight of Patrick Caldwell admitting a mistake. Then she sighed, stepping aside. "Come in." He did, glancing around the small apartment. It was simple, clean, nothing like the penthouses and suites he was used to. And yet, Abigail belonged here more than he had ever belonged in his own world. She motioned toward the couch. "Sit." He hesitated. Patrick Caldwell was not a man who took orders well, but eventually, he lowered himself onto the couch. Abigail sat across from him, waiting. Patrick exhaled. "Pierce is trying to force me out." She nodded. "I figured." He ran a hand through his hair. Frustration evident. "I need to know everything you have on him." Abigail tilted her head. "Why should I help you?" Patrick's jaw tightened. "Because if he takes me down, I guarantee you're next." That got her attention. She knew Pierce wasn't done. Her father had been his first victim. Patrick was just another target. And she was the last loose end. Abigail let out a slow breath. "Fine." Patrick sat up straighter. "Fine." She gave him a pointed look. "We work together. We take him down." A slow, calculating smile stretched across Patrick's face. "Now that's a deal I can work with." But Abigail wasn't finished. Her eyes narrowed. "One condition." Patrick's smile faded slightly. "What?" She leaned forward. "You listen to me?" Patrick's brows furrowed. "I know how Pierce operates," she continued. "I know his weaknesses, but if we're doing this, then we do it my way." Patrick hesitated. For years, he had never answered to anyone. He had built empires, crushed enemies, dictated terms. But now, he had no choice. He exhaled slowly, nodding once. "All right, Miss Montgomery." Abigail smirked. "Good. Now let's burn Jonathan Pierce to the ground." Patrick's smirk mirrored hers. For the first time in days, he felt like he might just win this war. Together, they were about to change the rules of the game, and Jonathan Pierce wouldn't see it coming. Patrick Caldwell was used to being the one controlling the board. He had built his empire on strategy, on knowing the game better than anyone else. But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't holding the reins. And the worst part, he had willingly handed them to Abigail Montgomery. She sat across from him, arms folded, eyes scanning the documents spread out on her small dining table. The apartment was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the tabletop as she thought. Patrick had seen men, powerful men, crumble under the weight of pressure. But Abigail, she thrived in it. She had been raised in a world of high-stakes deals, had watched men like him negotiate billions as if it were a simple chess game, and though she had spent years hiding from that world, it was still inside her. Now, he needed her to use it. "This is how we take him down," Abigail said finally. Tapping a name on one of the documents, Patrick leaned in, his eyes narrowing. Jared Langley. He knew the name. A high-profile investor, heavily involved in multiple companies, including Pierce's private accounts. "Langley is the weak link," Abigail continued. "He's not loyal. He follows money. If we put enough pressure on him, he'll turn on Pierce." Patrick smirked slightly. "You want to use one of Pierce's own men against him?" Abigail met his gaze. "Exactly." Patrick leaned back in his chair, considering. It was risky. Langley was unpredictable, a man with no real allegiance except to his bank account. But if they could make him panic, he might just give them what they needed. Patrick exhaled slowly. "What's the play?" Abigail's lips curled into a small, dangerous smile. "We destroy his confidence in Pierce." Jared Langley didn't like uncertainty, which made today an absolute nightmare. He sat in the back of his luxury sedan, his fingers gripping his phone as he read through the latest reports. Pierce's empire was crumbling under the weight of investigations, and now Caldwell Enterprises was fighting back. That wasn't supposed to happen. Langley had aligned himself with the winning side, or so he had thought. But now he wasn't sure. His car pulled up in front of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. He stepped out, smoothing his suit, composing himself. He had been summoned here by Patrick Caldwell, which meant Patrick was about to make a move, and Langley needed to decide whose side he was really on. Patrick was already seated when Langley entered the private dining room. Abigail sat beside him. Perfectly poised, the picture of cool confidence. Langley hesitated. He had expected Caldwell's usual associates, men in expensive suits, corporate lawyers, not a maid. Patrick smirked at his hesitation. "Sit." Langley forced a smile and did as he was told. "I have to admit, I was surprised to get your invitation." Patrick leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Let's cut through the bullshit, Langley. You back winners, you always have." Langley tensed slightly. "I like to think I back stability." Patrick's smirk deepened. "Then why are you still with Pierce?" Langley shifted in his seat. "Pierce's position is still strong." Abigail let out a quiet laugh. "That's cute." Langley's eyes snapped to her. He wasn't used to being mocked. Patrick tilted his head. "Tell me, Langley, when was the last time you actually saw Pierce?" Langley hesitated. Patrick continued. "He's not talking to investors. He's hiding, because he knows the moment people start asking the right questions, his empire collapses." Langley's grip on his glass tightened. Abigail leaned forward, her voice soft but deadly. "You're smart, Langley. You know exactly how this ends." Langley exhaled slowly, his confidence wavering. Patrick's smile returned. "So the only question left is, do you sync with him?" Langley swallowed hard. Patrick leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Then, finally, Langley sighed. "What do you want?" Abigail's smile widened. They had him. 2 hours later, Patrick sat across from Abigail in her apartment, the weight of what they had just done settling over them. Langley had cracked. He had handed over documents. Real. Incriminating evidence that tied Pierce to fraudulent transactions. It wasn't enough to take him down completely, but it was a start. Patrick exhaled, pouring himself a drink. "I'll admit, that was impressive." Abigail smirked. "I told you. You should listen to me." Patrick's jaw tightened. He didn't like taking orders, but he couldn't deny the truth. She had outplayed him. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, watching her. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Abigail tilted her head, watching you squirm a little. Patrick let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You really are your father's daughter." The amusement in her expression vanished. Patrick frowned slightly. "What?" Abigail set her glass down, her fingers tightening around the rim. "Don't compare me to him." Patrick's brows furrowed. "You're trying to clear his name." Her jaw clenched. "I'm trying to clear mine." Silence for the first time, Patrick realized. This wasn't just about revenge for her. This was about identity, about reclaiming who she was before the world took it away. Patrick watched her for a long moment. He had spent his life fighting to stay on top. But Abigail, she had spent hers fighting to exist at all. And maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than he had ever been. He exhaled slowly, setting his glass aside. "Then let's finish this." Abigail met his gaze, something sharp and determined in her eyes. "Yes," she said quietly. "Let's." And in that moment, they weren't enemies anymore. They were something else entirely, something dangerous. And Jonathan Pierce was about to find out just how dangerous. Jonathan Pierce had built his career on predictability. He knew how people would react before they even had time to think. He knew who to pressure, when to strike, and exactly how to dismantle an empire without getting his hands dirty. And for years, it had worked. Until now, Pierce sat in his penthouse office, the skyline of Manhattan stretching before him like a kingdom he had carved out with his own 2 hands. His assistant, a nervous man named Foster, placed a file on the desk. "We have a problem." Pierce exhaled through his nose, not looking up. "Fix it." Foster hesitated. "It's Patrick Caldwell." That got his attention. Pierce finally glanced at the file, flipping it open with measured precision. Inside were documents, ones he had hoped never to see again. Financial reports, leaked transactions, a trail leading straight to him. It was his own weapon being turned against him. Foster shifted uncomfortably. "We believe Langley flipped." Pierce clenched his jaw. Jared Langley had always been spineless, but he hadn't expected him to break this quickly. More than that, he hadn't expected Patrick Caldwell to fight back. His gaze darkened. This was supposed to be easy now. It was turning into a war, and Pierce did not lose. He closed the file calmly. Where is Caldwell now? Foster swallowed. He's meeting with investors, the ones we expected to pull out. Pierce smirked. Caldwell was desperate. He was scrambling. Perfect. Because when a man like Patrick Caldwell was cornered, he became reckless. And that was when Pierce would strike. Patrick knew the room was against him before he even walked in. The boardroom was filled with the most powerful investors in his company, each one waiting for a reason to abandon ship. This was exactly what Pierce wanted, and Patrick refused to give it to him. He stepped forward, his suit impeccable, his expression unreadable. Abigail walked beside him, composed as ever. The only person in this room who wasn't doubting him. That mattered more than he cared to admit. One of the senior board members, Gerald Whitmore, cleared his throat. Patrick, I think we all know why we're here. Patrick smirked. Oh, please enlighten me. Whitmore narrowed his eyes. We need reassurance. The fraud allegations are manufactured. Patrick cut in smoothly. We have proof. A murmur spread across the room. Abigail stepped forward, placing the file onto the table. Whitmore hesitated before flipping it open. His expression shifted. Abigail spoke before he could recover. Jonathan Pierce has been manipulating your investments for months. If you walk away from Caldwell Enterprises, you're not just abandoning Patrick. She tilted her head. You're walking straight into Pierce's trap. Silence. Patrick watched, amused as the power dynamic began to shift. Whitmore set the file down, rubbing his chin. This is a serious accusation. Patrick nodded. It is. He leaned forward. And I don't make them lightly. Another investor, a woman named Evelyn Strauss, frowned. How do we know this isn't just a last-ditch effort to save your company? Patrick smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Abigail reached into her bag, pulling out a USB drive. She slid it across the table. Because this, she said, is a recorded conversation between Langley and Pierce. Whitmore's eyes widened. Patrick sat back, watching as they processed the reality. Pierce hadn't just come after him. He had been using them all along. Patrick tapped his fingers against the table. You wanted reassurance. Here it is. Stay with me, and you'll come out on top. His eyes gleamed. Or side with Pierce, and go down with him. Silence then. Whitmore slowly nodded. We stay. Patrick smirked. Checkmate. Pierce was furious. He gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. How the hell did Caldwell get his hands on that recording? He snapped. On the other end of the line, his associate hesitated. It was the girl. Pierce stiffened. What girl? Abigail Montgomery. Silence. Slowly, Pierce sat back in his chair. The name echoed through his mind. He hadn't thought about Montgomery in years, not since he had destroyed Richard Montgomery's empire, watched him lose everything. And now, his daughter had come back to finish the job. Pierce exhaled, composing himself. So she wanted to fight. Fine. But she was about to learn something very important. Patrick Caldwell was a pawn in this game. She was the real target now, and Pierce always took out his threats. Abigail felt the unease settle in her stomach before she even stepped out of the elevator. Something was wrong. The energy in the hotel had shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah met her at the hallway, her expression tight. You have a problem. Abigail's pulse quickened. What? Sarah swallowed. A man came looking for you. Abigail stilled. Sarah hesitated. He didn't say his name, but he left a message. She handed Abigail a small black envelope. Abigail's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single note, handwritten, precise. You should have stayed in the shadows. Her blood ran cold. Pierce knew. She lifted her head, her heart hammering. Sarah's voice was quiet. What does it mean? Abigail exhaled slowly. It means, she said, gripping the note, that I just became his real problem. And she had no intention of running this time. Abigail Montgomery had spent years disappearing. She had learned how to exist without drawing attention, how to move through life as if she were nothing more than a shadow. It had kept her safe, but now, she had done the one thing she had promised herself. She never would. She had made herself visible, and Jonathan Pierce had noticed. The note in her hands felt heavier than it should have. The words, So simple, so precise, were a warning, a promise. Pierce wasn't just watching. He was coming for her. Sarah shifted beside her, clearly unsettled. Abby? Who is this guy? Abigail swallowed hard, her mind racing. Someone I should have buried a long time ago? Sarah hesitated. You think he's dangerous? Abigail let out a humorless laugh. Sarah, he ruined my family and never looked back. She exhaled sharply. I'd be an idiot to think he won't try again. Sarah's expression darkened. Then you can't stay here. Abigail knew that. Pierce wouldn't hesitate to destroy her if she became an obstacle. And now she wasn't just an obstacle. She was a threat. She clenched the note in her fist, which meant it was time to stop playing defense. She needed to go on the attack. Patrick Caldwell had never believed in fate. He believed in power, control, and strategy. And right now, he was dangerously close to losing all three. He sat in his office, listening to Elliot list off the latest casualties in his financial war with Pierce. More investors had pulled out. His stock was still dropping. The only reason his empire wasn't in flames yet was because of Abigail Montgomery. And now, she was in danger. He stood abruptly, cutting off Elliot mid-sentence. Where is she? Elliot blinked. Sir? Abigail, Patrick snapped. Where is she right now? Elliot hesitated. She's still at the hotel, but Patrick was already moving. He didn't know why the idea of Pierce going after Abigail bothered him this much. He just knew that if something happened to her, he would never forgive himself. Abigail was already packing when the knock came at her door. She turned, gripping the nearest heavy object, a glass paperweight, before slowly moving toward the entrance. Abigail, it's me. Patrick. She exhaled, her grip loosening as she unlocked the door. The moment he stepped inside, she could see the tension radiating from him. His usual cold composure was cracked, his blue eyes sharper than usual. You got a message from Pierce. It wasn't a question. She nodded, tossing the note onto the table. Patrick's gaze flickered over the words, his jaw tightening. That bastard. Abigail studied him. You look upset. Patrick let out a harsh breath. Upset doesn't begin to cover it. There was something almost unfamiliar in his voice. Concern. Anger. She couldn't tell. She crossed her arms. I can handle this. Patrick's gaze snapped to hers. No, you can't. Her jaw tightened. Excuse me. He stepped closer, his presence unshakable. You don't know what Pierce is capable of. She lifted her chin. Actually, I do. Better than you. Patrick exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. That's exactly why you need to leave. Abigail frowned. Leave. Patrick nodded. I have properties outside the city. Safe locations. You stay there until this is over. Abigail laughed. Not because it was funny, but because Patrick Caldwell actually thought she was the kind of person who would run. She stepped forward, invading his space. I'm not hiding. Patrick clenched his jaw. Abigail, no, she snapped. Pierce has controlled my life long enough. I'm done running. Patrick stared at her. For the first time, he saw it. Not just the fire in her eyes, not just the anger, but the strength. She wasn't the girl her father had raised. She was someone more dangerous, more determined, more like him. A slow smirk touched his lips. All right then, Abigail narrowed her eyes. All right, Patrick stepped back, nodding. Then let's take the fight to him. Abigail studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. Now that, she said, is the first intelligent thing you've said all day. Patrick chuckled. Don't get used to it. Abigail smirked. No promises. Pierce's world was built on certainty. He controlled people. He controlled narratives. But for the first time in years, he was losing control. He sat in his office, watching as his security footage played on the screen. Grainy, but clear enough to show Patrick Caldwell entering Abigail Montgomery's apartment. He narrowed his eyes. He had expected Caldwell to collapse under the weight of his empire crumbling. But instead, he was fighting back, and Abigail was fighting with him. Pierce exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. They thought they could win this. How adorable. He leaned forward, his voice smooth as he spoke to his assistant. Tell our contacts inside Caldwell Enterprises to move forward. Foster hesitated. Move forward with what? Pierce smiled. But it wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was the smile of a man who had already decided how this would end. Make them disappear. Foster paled. "Sir." Pierce's smile faded. "Do it." Foster swallowed hard and nodded before rushing out. Pierce leaned back, watching the footage again. They thought they had won, but he was about to remind them who really controlled this game. Abigail and Patrick stood side by side in his office, the city stretching out before them. A war was brewing and they were ready. Patrick turned to her. "Are you sure about this?" Abigail met his gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Patrick smirked. "Then let's burn Pierce to the ground." Abigail grinned. "After you." And together, they stepped into the fire. Patrick Caldwell had fought his way to the top, crushing anyone who stood in his way. But this was different. This wasn't just business. This wasn't about money, power, or dominance. This was personal. Jonathan Pierce had made it personal when he went after Abigail. Patrick wasn't a man driven by sentiment. He didn't care about justice, about making things right. But there was something about Abigail Montgomery that made him want to win this fight for more than just himself. And that was dangerous, because Patrick Caldwell didn't fight for anyone but himself. Until now, Abigail sat in Patrick's office, flipping through documents as the city lights flickered outside. She had always imagined this moment, the day she would finally take on the man who had destroyed her family. But she had never imagined doing it with Patrick Caldwell. The irony wasn't lost on her. He had been the kind of man she hated. Cold, ruthless, untouchable. The kind of man who had helped Pierce build an empire by stepping on people like her. But then, he had lost everything. And for the first time, he understood what it felt like to be on the other side. Maybe that's why she was starting to trust him. She shook the thought away and focused on the plan. Jared Langley had flipped, handing them the first real piece of evidence they needed. But they needed more. They needed a direct hit, and Abigail knew exactly where to strike. Pierce had built his empire on secrecy, but every empire had a weak spot. For Pierce, it was the Caribbean accounts. Abigail traced her fingers over the files Patrick's team had recovered. It was all coded, hidden behind layers of false shell companies, but the pattern was familiar. Her father had used the same system. Pierce had stolen his methods, and now it would be his downfall. She turned to Patrick. "If we leak this, the authorities will start digging." Patrick smirked. "And Pierce won't be able to stop them." He leaned closer, his voice low. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Abigail's lips curved into a smirk. "A little." Patrick chuckled. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." She arched a brow. "Oh, Caldwell, you've been on my bad side since the day we met." His grin widened, but before he could respond, Elliot burst into the room. "We have a problem." Patrick's amusement vanished instantly. "What?" Elliot's expression was tight. "One of our key witnesses, Jared Langley, is missing." Silence. Abigail's heart dropped. Patrick's face darkened. "Missing." Elliot nodded. "No sign of him?" His security detail was compromised. His last known location was his apartment. And now he's gone. Abigail cursed under her breath. Pierce had moved faster than they expected. Patrick clenched his fists. "We need to find him." Elliot hesitated. "That's not all." Patrick exhaled sharply. "Spit it out." Elliot set down his phone, playing an audio recording. The moment Abigail heard the voice, she froze. "Pierce." His voice was smooth, confident, completely unbothered. "I warned you, Patrick." Patrick's jaw tightened. "You think you can win this? You think you can outplay me?" Abigail's stomach twisted. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The recording ended. A heavy silence filled the room. Abigail slowly looked at Patrick. "He's making his move." Patrick's expression was cold. "Then we make ours." Langley was the key. Without him, their evidence meant nothing. Abigail paced the room, her mind racing. If Pierce took him, he won't be far. Patrick nodded. He'll want to keep Langley under control, but still accessible if he needs to make a public move. Elliot exhaled. There's a private estate Pierce owns upstate, secluded, no digital records. Patrick smirked. That's where he is. Abigail crossed her arms. Then let's go get him. Elliot blinked. You're serious? Patrick glanced at Abigail. She was deadly serious. Patrick smirked. Oh, I like her. The drive to the estate was long and quiet. Abigail sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the dark road ahead. Patrick finally broke the silence. "You don't have to do this." She turned to him. "Yes, I do." Patrick sighed. "This isn't just about revenge, is it?" Abigail's fingers tightened in her lap. "No." Patrick glanced at her. Waiting, she exhaled. "I want to win." Patrick smirked. "Now you sound like me." Abigail chuckled softly. "That should probably worry me." Patrick laughed. But beneath the humor, they both knew the truth. This wasn't just business anymore. This was war. And tonight, they were going to war. The estate was heavily guarded. Patrick and Abigail crouched in the shadows, assessing the situation. "We can't go in guns blazing," Patrick murmured. Abigail smirked. "You'd be surprised what I can do without a gun." Patrick arched a brow. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." She rolled her eyes. "You keep saying that. Yet here we are." Patrick chuckled. But then, his expression turned serious. "Are you ready for this?" Abigail met his gaze. "I was born ready." And with that, they moved, silent, precise. Two people who had once been enemies, now working together to burn Pierce's empire to the ground. Tonight, they would change everything, and Pierce would never see it coming. The estate loomed in the distance, its towering iron gates standing like a silent warning against trespassers. Jonathan Pierce didn't take risks. He eliminated them, and Jared Langley, the only man who could bring him down, was inside. Patrick and Abigail crouched behind a line of trees, surveying the property. It was heavily guarded, just as they had expected. Armed security, multiple checkpoints, surveillance cameras covering every angle. Patrick exhaled slowly. "This isn't going to be easy." Abigail smirked. "I didn't expect it to be." He glanced at her, shaking his head. "You really enjoy this, don't you?" She shrugged. "I enjoy winning." Patrick chuckled. "You really are a dangerous woman, Montgomery." She arched a brow. "You're just now figuring that out." Patrick smirked. Then, his expression hardened as he turned back to the estate. The game was over. It was time to move. Pierce's men were well trained, but they weren't expecting Patrick Caldwell and Abigail Montgomery. They moved in the shadows, silent and precise. Patrick took out the first guard with a quick, efficient strike. Swift, brutal, controlled. Abigail followed, slipping past the second guard before he even realized she was there. They made their way toward the side entrance, avoiding the cameras. Slipping through blind spots, Patrick glanced at Abigail. "You're scarily good at this," she smirked. "You think I spent my whole life cleaning floors?" Patrick shook his head, biting back a grin. They reached the service entrance, where a single guard stood smoking a cigarette, unaware of the storm heading his way. Patrick moved first, grabbing the man from behind, cutting off his breath in one swift motion. He crumpled to the ground. Abigail exhaled. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Patrick grinned. "That's my line." She rolled her eyes. "Come on, we have a rat to rescue." Jared Langley was exactly where they expected him to be, locked in the basement. Tied to a chair, looking half dead, Abigail moved first, kneeling beside him. "Jared," he groaned, lifting his head. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut from a brutal beating. "Damn," he rasped. "I was hoping I'd died." Patrick smirked. "Not yet, but keep talking and I might consider it." Langley half laughed, half coughed. "Caldwell, never thought I'd see the day you'd play hero." Patrick rolled his eyes. "I'm not here to save you. I'm here to destroy Pierce." Abigail quickly cut the ropes binding Langley's wrists. "Can you walk?" Langley winced but nodded. "Barely." Patrick grabbed him by the arm, hauling him up. "Then move. We don't have much time." Langley let out a pained grunt. "You sure know how to make a guy feel welcome?" Abigail smirked. "We'll throw you a party once Pierce is in handcuffs." Langley chuckled weakly. "I'll hold you to that." They made their way toward the exit. But just as they reached the back door, an alarm blared. Patrick cursed. "Time's up," Abigail muttered. Langley swayed slightly. "You two really know how to make an entrance." Patrick clenched his jaw. "Move, now." The estate erupted into chaos. Pierce's men flooded the grounds, weapons drawn, searching for the intruders. Patrick and Abigail moved fast. Dragging Langley between them, they stayed low, hidden in the dark, dodging the searchlights sweeping across the property. Patrick pressed a finger to his earpiece. Elliot. Elliot's voice crackled through. I'm here. We need extraction now. Already on it. You've got about 2 minutes before they seal the exits. Patrick gritted his teeth. Then we'll have to make this quick. They reached the outer perimeter, just as a group of armed guards rounded the corner. Stop! One of them barked, raising his weapon. Patrick reacted instantly. He shoved Langley toward Abigail, then lunged forward, grabbing the nearest guard's gun before he could fire. A sharp twist. A bone-crunching snap. And the man collapsed. Abigail didn't hesitate. She spun, kicking another guard hard in the ribs, sending him crashing into the hedge. Patrick grabbed the last guard by the collar, slamming him into the wall. The man gasped, stunned. Patrick leaned in, his voice low. Lethal. Tell Pierce we're coming for him. Then he let him drop. Go! Patrick snapped. They ran. A black SUV skidded onto the road just as they cleared the gate. Elliot threw the door open. Get in! Patrick shoved Langley into the back seat. Abigail followed, slamming the door shut just as the first wave of gunfire rang out behind them. The SUV peeled away, tires screeching, leaving the estate behind. Breathing hard, Patrick turned to Abigail. She grinned. Not bad, Caldwell. Patrick smirked. I aim to impress. Langley groaned. Can you two flirt later? I think I'm dying. Abigail rolled her eyes. You'll live. Patrick exhaled. Running a hand through his hair. They had won this battle. But the war was just beginning. Jonathan Pierce watched the footage in silence. His estate, breached. His men, overpowered. And Patrick Caldwell and Abigail Montgomery standing side by side. Victorious. Pierce exhaled slowly. Closing his laptop then, for the first time in years, he smiled. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. And he wasn't done playing yet. The safe house was nothing special. A quiet, unassuming townhouse on the outskirts of the city. Neutral territory. Patrick had used it before. A place to regroup when the world outside turned into a war zone. And now, it was their battlefield. Jared Langley groaned as he collapsed onto the worn-out leather couch, pressing an ice pack to his bruised ribs. I hate both of you. Abigail smirked. That's gratitude for you. Patrick ignored him. Pacing near the window, his mind already working through the next steps, they had won the rescue mission. But the war wasn't over. Not even close. Elliot leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Pierce isn't going to sit back and take this. Patrick exhaled sharply. I know. Langley groaned again. And that's why I'm screwed. Abigail turned to him, her voice sharp. No, that's why you start talking. Langley eyed her warily. What do you want to know? She crossed her arms. Everything. Langley hesitated. You don't get it, Pierce. He doesn't just ruin people, he erases them. Patrick scoffed. Then let's erase him first. Langley let out a bitter laugh. You don't just erase Jonathan Pierce. Abigail stepped closer, lowering her voice. Jared, listen to me. We don't have time for hesitation. You either help us, or you'll be running for the rest of your life. Langley swallowed hard. Then, reluctantly, he pulled out his phone. I have something, he admitted. Patrick's gaze sharpened. What is it? Langley hesitated. A recording. Abigail's eyes narrowed. Of what? Langley sighed, rubbing a hand over his bruised face. A conversation between Pierce and someone on the inside. Patrick and Abigail exchanged a glance. Langley clicked a few buttons, then held the phone up. The audio crackled, then a familiar voice filled the room. Jonathan Pierce. Everything is in place. Caldwell won't see it coming. A second voice responded, low and measured. And Montgomery. Abigail's breath hitched. Pierce let out a quiet chuckle. She's a loose end, but not for long. Silence. Patrick clenched his fists. Who's the other voice? Langley hesitated. I don't know, but whoever it is, they're on the inside. Abigail's stomach twisted. Someone was working with Pierce. Someone close. Patrick turned to Elliot. Run voice analysis. Find out who it is. Elliot nodded, already moving. Patrick exhaled, turning back to Langley. This is enough to start, but we need more. Langley sighed. I might have something else, but it's risky. Patrick smirked. Risk is my favorite language. Abigail rolled her eyes. "Let's just hear it." Langley hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "I know where Pierce keeps his insurance files." Silence. Patrick stilled. "You're sure?" Langley nodded. "I used to handle some of his accounts. He has a vault, hard copies, backups. Everything he needs in case things ever go south." Abigail narrowed her eyes. "Where?" Langley licked his lips. "A private building downtown. High security. But if we get in, we get everything." Patrick exhaled slowly. This was it. The final play. They could take Pierce down. But first, they had to break into the lion's den and survive. Pierce's office, the other side of the war, Jonathan Pierce had built his empire on certainty. Every move, every transaction, every betrayal. It was all calculated. But Patrick Caldwell and Abigail Montgomery, they were wild cards. And he did not like wild cards. He sat in his penthouse office, swirling a glass of whiskey, watching the city lights stretch endlessly before him. He had built this empire with his own 2 hands. And now, they thought they could take it from him. Adorable. Foster, his assistant, stepped inside, clearing his throat. "Sir, Langley is gone." Pierce smirked. "Of course he is." Foster hesitated. "Should we?" "No." Pierce took a slow sip. "Let them think they're winning." Foster frowned. "Sir." Pierce set his glass down. Then, with a slow, predatory smile, he said, "I already know what they're planning." Foster stiffened. "How?" Pierce exhaled, glancing at his watch. "Because, Foster..." He looked up, eyes gleaming. "I have my own spies." Back at the safe house, unraveling the betrayal, Patrick stared at the screen. Watching as Elliot worked through the voice analysis, minutes passed in silence. Then, the computer beeped. A name appeared on the screen. Patrick's blood ran cold. Abigail stepped closer, reading the name aloud. Elliot. Her voice was barely a whisper. Patrick's second-in-command, his most trusted advisor. The man who had been by his side through everything, and he was the mole. Patrick clenched his jaw. "No, that's not possible." Elliot froze. Langley groaned. "I told you. Pierce has people everywhere." Abigail turned slowly. "You've been feeding him information, haven't you?" Elliot swallowed hard. "Patrick, Patrick's fist slammed onto the table. "How long?" Elliot hesitated. Abigail's stomach twisted. Pierce had known everything. The rescue, the vault, their every move. Because Elliot had been giving him the playbook. Patrick took a step forward, voice low and dangerous. "Tell me why I shouldn't kill you right now." Elliot's hands shook. He made me an offer. I didn't think..." Patrick's rage boiled over. "You didn't think..." Elliot's voice broke. "I thought he would win." Silence. Abigail exhaled slowly. "Well, Elliot," she murmured, eyes cold as steel. "You made a bad bet." Patrick clenched his fists. Pierce had played him, again. But not anymore. He turned to Abigail. "We're still going after the vault." She nodded. "We just have to do it before Pierce expects it." Patrick exhaled, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. This ends now. And for the first time in his life, Patrick Caldwell wasn't just playing to win. He was playing to end a war. The tension in the safe house was palpable. Patrick stood rigid, his hands gripping the back of a chair as he processed the betrayal. Elliot, the man he had trusted for years, had been working for Pierce all along. Abigail watched him carefully. She could see it, the barely restrained rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Patrick Caldwell didn't tolerate traitors. Elliot, looking more like a trapped animal than a man, lifted his hands slowly. "Patrick, I didn't have a choice." Patrick's jaw tightened. "You always have a choice." Elliot swallowed. "Pierce had leverage. He knew things. About my past, my family. He said if I didn't help him, he'd..." Patrick scoffed. "And instead of coming to me, you sold me out." Silence. Abigail spoke up, her voice sharp. "How much does he know?" Elliot hesitated. Patrick's patience snapped. He grabbed Elliot by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "How much?" Elliot gasped. "Everything. He knows about Langley. About the vault. He knows you're coming." Patrick's grip tightened. Abigail stepped forward, placing a hand on Patrick's arm. "We need to think." Patrick's breath was uneven, but he let go. stepping back. "You're lucky I don't kill you." Elliot exhaled shakily, rubbing his neck. Abigail turned to Langley. "Can we still get to the vault?" Langley nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, but if Pierce knows we're coming, he'll have every safeguard possible." Patrick's smirk was cold. "Then we'll have to be unpredictable." Abigail crossed her arms. "How?" Patrick's blue eyes gleamed. "We changed the game. Pierce's fortress, the vault." Jonathan Pierce stood in his private office, overlooking the security feeds. He had expected them to come for the vault. That was the point. They were walking straight into his trap. He turned to Foster, who stood nervously by the door. "Are my men in position?" Foster nodded. "Yes, sir. If they make a move, we'll have them." Pierce smirked. Good. This was checkmate. Patrick Caldwell had been a worthy opponent. But this was the end, or so he thought. Breaking the vault. Patrick, Abigail, and Langley arrived at the building downtown. From the outside, it looked like a typical corporate headquarters. But they knew better. Langley led them through the back entrance, bypassing the main security checkpoints. Inside, Abigail glanced around. "How many guards?" Langley exhaled. "Too many." Patrick rolled his shoulders. "Then we don't fight them." Abigail frowned. "What's your plan?" Patrick smirked. "We use Pierce's arrogance against him." Abigail arched a brow. "How?" Patrick pulled out his phone. "We make him think he's already won." The call. Pierce was sitting at his desk when his phone buzzed, a video call request from Patrick Caldwell. Pierce smirked and answered, "Patrick, I was wondering when you'd call." Patrick leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "You win." Pierce blinked. "What?" Patrick sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm done. You were always 3 steps ahead. I see that now." Pierce narrowed his eyes. "You don't give up." Patrick chuckled. "You're right, I don't. But this is different." Pierce leaned forward. "Go on." Patrick exhaled. "Let's make a deal." Pierce smirked. "Hook, line, and sinker." "I'm listening." Patrick's voice remained even. "I walk away. I leave everything behind. You keep the company, the investors, all of it." Pierce tilted his head. "And in return," Patrick's eyes darkened, "you let Abigail go." Silence. "Then," Pierce laughed. "Oh, Patrick, I never took you for the sentimental type." Patrick smirked. "Even I surprise myself." Pierce shook his head. "And what's stopping me from taking your deal and killing you both anyway?" Patrick shrugged. "Nothing. But if you wanted us dead, we'd be dead already." Pierce leaned back. "You're not as stupid as I thought." Patrick smirked. "So we have a deal." Pierce chuckled. "Maybe. Where are you now?" Patrick held up his hands. "Close. You'll find out soon enough." Pierce narrowed his eyes. Patrick ended the call. Abigail stared at him. That was risky. Patrick grinned. That was stalling. Langley swallowed. "You sure he bought it?" Patrick's smirk widened. "He doesn't know we're already inside." Abigail's eyes widened. "Wait, you..." Patrick turned to Langley. "Show me the way to the vault." Langley exhaled sharply. "Follow me." And just like that, the real game began. Pierce's fatal mistake. Pierce leaned back in his chair. Considering Patrick's words, something felt off. Patrick Caldwell didn't surrender. Then it hit him. He replayed the call in his mind. The background, no movement, no hotel suite, no sign of an actual escape plan. His stomach twisted. "Where is he?" he barked. Foster hesitated. "Sir." Pierce's heart pounded. "He's not calling from a safe house." Realization slammed into him. They're already in the building. The vault cracks open. Langley worked fast, his hands shaking as he bypassed the security codes. Patrick and Abigail stood behind him, their backs pressed to the walls, waiting for the inevitable. Langley exhaled sharply. Got it. The massive vault door unlocked. Abigail stepped forward, eyes scanning the files, hard drives, physical documents. Patrick smirked. Pierce's entire empire. Abigail moved quickly, gathering everything. "We need to go. Now." Footsteps. Heavy. Rushed. Patrick cursed. Too late. Abigail turned. Security was coming. Langley paled. "We're trapped." Patrick's jaw tightened. "No, we're not." He grabbed the hard drives, shoving them into his bag. Then he turned to Abigail. "We end this now." Abigail's eyes blazed. "Let's do it." And as the first wave of guards stormed the vault, they didn't run, they fought. Because this wasn't just about survival. This was about winning. And tonight, Pierce would lose everything.